regards the police
Yep.
and the rules that they have to abide by, like the Police Regulations Act 2008, how would you feel if, in a recent High Court case, a judge says that the New Zealand police don't have to adhere to Section 27 of the Bill of Rights?
Well, the judges are clearly wrong, because they do. I mean, not only that, they're bound by it. Section 3A of the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act clearly says that government departments, and the police are a government department, are bound by the Bill of Rights Act. End of story.
There's an example of a judge making that kind of decision.
Yeah, well, I'd be very surprised to see you put it in a judgment, you know, because it's clearly wrong.
So how do we, and then what happens is, where do we file now?
Well,
Court of Appeal?
you have to go to the Court of Appeal, because it's appellate review. That's how the system is.
Well, this particular woman has been trying to get justice for 12 years. You get worn out and tired.
I know, you get frustrated, you get ground down. But hey, you've got to carry on, because otherwise the bastards will win. Do you want that? That's what keeps me going. Okay, I'm up against overwhelming odds throughout, right? You try and fight the Crown Law Office from a bloody jailhouse cell with no resources, right? But you will not let the bastards win. And once you get that determination and passion, you will win.
Well, it does seem like a David and Goliath exercise in trying to get justice in New Zealand.
Of course it is.
So then why are we not getting the politicians to give us a far more even playing field?
Well, they don't think it's going to get any votes for them, obviously. So you have to make it clear to them that they're going to lose votes, or they may not be a politician much longer if they don't insist on the laws of the land being adhered to. I mean, that was ridiculous.
You've just said that Section 27 needs to be adhered to, even by the New Zealand.
And not only
police.
that, Section 27 is a very important section. It's natural justice. It's the right to be heard. It's the right to have a full and fair hearing, you know, and it's basic natural justice.
So if someone does a judicial review on that decision, on that basis.
Who was the judge? A High Court judge.
Yes.
You cannot judicially review a High Court judge. That's one of the things in our law. Yeah, the High Court reviews everyone lower than them. You cannot judicially review a High Court judge. You can only appeal her decision.
Well, that's interesting, because in my case I was with Justice Peters. And
oh, yes, I know Justice Peters. Well.
Isn't she famous?
Justice Peters is famous. Someone actually ran her over.
Shame.
Oh, great shame. And while I was waiting for a decision, and a very important decision in the prison strip search case, she heard the prison strip search case, right? Where 270 prisoners at Primero Maximum Security Prison were unlawfully strip searched, and I eventually got them $1,000 each. Not through Justice Peters, but she awarded me and another prisoner $1,000 each, and our case was the precedent for the other 240 or whatever it was getting their $1,000 each too for an unlawful strip search. But while we were waiting for the decision, and she was very long time in bringing it out, was Justice Peters, several months, which was a pretty straightforward, clear-cut case, she unfortunately got run over by someone. Yeah, it happens to the best of us.
Yeah, well...
Don't wish it on anyone.
She was pretty rude.
Maybe it was karma, who knows?
She was pretty outrageous in my case, where she allowed Crown Law to supply their submissions right there in front of her when we were hearing the case on the submission. So I never even got a right to even have a look at it.
Well,
and I said it was an unfair trial.
Well, not only is
she said, well, I'm listening to it anyway, Mr. Evans.
Yeah, well, because she's a law unto herself, obviously, Justice Peters.
Well, you know, she's one of those people,
I'm going to be brutally frank here, she should never have been a High Court judge. She hasn't got the intellectual grunt to be a High Court judge.
Well, she has been being monitored or mentored.
I wonder who should have appointed her as a High Court judge. Would it be that Finlayson when he was Attorney General?
Well,
I don't know.
Well, you know, his background, I saw him in Rotorua.
Oh, yeah, he ought to be bloody well ashamed of himself.
I totally agree. I actually embarrassed and humiliated
him. He's an embarrassment to New Zealand.
In front of a whole lot of tourists.
Yeah.
With regards to the Lake Ellis case.
Yeah, good on you. Yeah. Oh, don't even start on Lake Ellis. Christ, that was any self-respecting democracy that supposedly values human rights would be thoroughly ashamed of itself over
those people were electrified on their genitals.
Yeah, I know.
And they were kids.
Look, I was threatened with it myself, for God's sake, you know, at the Pororo Hospital when they bloody well threw me in there for a short stint, you know. Yeah.
Best interest of the child. What a bunch of bollocks.
Well, it's a load of bullshit. Look, we used to run Russia down because it was well known that they used to send dissidents, you know, to psychiatric hospitals and make out they were crazy or insane or whatever. Yet New Zealand was doing much the same to a lot of its kids. I call them the stolen generation. Because 100,000 kids put through the system. You know.
And you wonder why they end up
I was wondering.
in gangs?
Look at it, I wonder why they weren't in a bloody gang, you know?
End up in prison?
I wonder why they weren't in bloody prison. You know, the poor little buggers are born perfectly little angels, and whatever happens to them after that, that's not how they were born. You know, it's through their experiences and whatever's happened to them and you know, their path that's been in life, you know. There's no bloody need for any of it. That's what annoys the hell out of me. You know? You know, and I've turned kids around in jail. You know, some people I teach them to read and write.
So I've pulled up some documents from the United Nations of recent, which says that New Zealand has actually written itself out of the law for the ability to compensate people who've had breaches of justice.
Well, they brought that Prisoners and Victims Claims Act in, and yes, it's one of the most atrocious laws on our books.
But that's part of our Declaration on Human Rights and Civil and Political Rights that we've signed.
Well, that's what worries me about. See, New Zealand had a wonderful human rights record back in built very proudly back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. You know, generally the law was adhered to. You know, although we've got these atrocious chapters in our history where it wasn't, but it had a reason to, you know, reasonably be proud of itself. You know, because a lot of this the government figures never knew about because we didn't have social media, we didn't have you know, it all on the front page like we do now, stuff like, you know, these abuses that were going on in these psychiatric hospitals. Nobody really knew about them other than those that were involved. And with any questions raised, they sort of soothed it over with a load of BS. But now there's no excuse because everybody knows what's going on. And here's New Zealand solemnly signs these documents, the representative of the government signs these documents promising to adhere to them, promising to make the agencies of the government adhere to them, promising to uphold these people's rights, and then goes home and promptly forgets about them. And that's
exactly what's happening.
That's exactly what's happening, and it's a disgusting and disgraceful that people really want to live in a country like that. And don't think it doesn't affect you, people out there, because it does. Sooner or later, sooner or later, and I'm sorry, I'm being a bit passionate about this, but it is really a cause close to my heart. This will come close to you with one of your loved ones. So it's in your best interest to try and fix this system or help us fix this broken system now.
Well, as we know, through many security intelligence reports, New Zealand is the highest rate of disenfranchised New Zealanders in the population.
Yeah, and the problem is that a lot of people out there think, oh shit, they don't bother voting, they don't bother getting engaged in the political process, they think, oh, it's not going to make any difference. Well, it can make a difference. Just think back to the US presidential elections in Florida, what was it, Bush and Gore, right? Yeah, you know, that was a stolen election, but a few thousand votes made the difference to the United States presidential elections. 200 million, country, 240 million people. A few thousand. So get out there, register and vote.
But it seems to most New Zealanders, it doesn't make a lot of difference between blue and red and black.
Well, that's right, because politicians only act in their best interests or their cronies' best interests, not the general New Zealand public. And this message needs to be got across.
And that's why, do you think there's a lot more smaller parties forming out there in New Zealand?
Yeah, well, there's people out there that don't feel they've got a voice in the present two-party system. You know, I mean, let's be frank, the Labour Party, who is supposed to represent the workers, was hijacked in the mid-80s. You know? Well, Roger Douglas and bloody Michael Bassett and their ilk. You know? And suddenly the working person of New Zealand had no ally. No one to speak up for them. Yeah, that's what happened.
Thrown under the bus.
Thrown under the bloody bus.
If you were a Maori,
yep,
and we're not,
yeah,
but if you were a Maori with 7 MPs in Parliament, in Labour, would you be pissed off? Because where is their voice? Willie Jackson seems to have strangled them alive.
Well, Willie's a character, you know. I knew his mother June. She was actually on the parole board for years. Good families, the Jacksons, but look, Willie was a union delegate, you know. But look, so was some of the bloody idiots in the Labour government in the mid-80s that sold the workers out, you know. You know, look, when I first went to work, I worked in the motor vehicle assembly industries. We had a bloody motor vehicle assembly industry, you know, in New Zealand, in Australia. And I moved to Australia, and the wages that we were getting in New Zealand was the same as in Australia, or even better, some of them. Except in Aussie we had a 17.5% leave loading, I think it was, and added on to ours. Hey, but they were broadly similar. Now look at the difference between wages in New Zealand and Australia. And that's because the Kiwi worker was sold out, and in Australia, you know, workers' rights have generally been upheld. You know, because they've been represented. Their interests have been listened to, and they've been represented effectively. Here, where is the workers' representative? And the vast majority of Kiwis, they're workers. They're not these bloody people that the government supposedly represents now.
And they're the ones actually paying the most tax.
Absolutely. Look at the share of the tax take that's paid by companies, and look at the share of the vast bulk of taxes comes from GST. And who pays GST? The workers, because they consume every cent of their bloody salary, whereas the rich, they simply spend on overseas holidays or stashing it away in the bank, so they're not buying anything with it, or very little. That's where the people who pay the vast bulk of taxes in this country are not being effectively represented. It's as simple as that.
Concern. My concern is that New Zealanders have become a bunch of sheep, and there's only two major parties, and none of us are being protected because one's as bad as the other.
Well, look who represents.
And we've got Tracy Martin really running the show for New Zealand first. Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
and she's running SIFs.
I know. Yeah, I know. With this country, there's a hell of a lot of good people in New Zealand, people that are able to do the job, But the way that you've got to go back to how our political system and our party political system, and how these MPs are selected. I mean, most people will either vote National or Labour, and they'll vote whoever the hell it is, right? So how do these parties select these people to be their bloody their candidates? And look at it, it's done by a little small closed club. How the friggin' hell did John Key get to be selected for bloody Helensville? Come back from the United States and suddenly he's suddenly big news, with 55 million in the kitty from his days at Merrill Lynch. How is this allowed to happen? Why isn't there some torchlight shown on?
What about Mark Mitchell?
Mark Mitchell. A nasty piece of work, Mark Mitchell.
Absolutely.
I know him from his days when he was a police officer, a dog handler in Gisborne, and used to sick his dog on people.
What people don't seem
nasty
to be aware
piece of work.
that man actually, in his company, employed mercenaries.
Absolutely. He's got a very, very dark history. Mark Mitchell is lucky he himself is not in prison. I can tell you that right now. And here he is, the Justice spokesman? But hey, where are the media exposing all the skeletons of Mark Mitchell's cupboards?
What about Paula Benefit?
Don't even get me started on that woman. A woman who got all the advantages of a reasonable welfare system and then took it away from everyone else. Her successors. How disgusting. She got everything through her welfare system. Her education, her house, everything. Her ability to stand for Parliament, and then she took it away from the other people. But then she's not the only one.
Well, let's look at Simon Bridges that allegedly has doctored the money that was coming in from Chinese influence.
And Judith Collins. And where do you stop? And they got the cheek to lock other Kiwis up in jail for bloody shit like...
Jamie Lee Ross, they were trying to put him in under the Mental Health Act.
Yeah, well, there you go. I mean, Jamie's been through a lot of his own misfortunes in my opinion. But, sadly, But, who knows what was going on there. I think Jamie had all sorts of becoming the leader of the National Party and had the rug pulled out from under him by his supporters. But, who knows?
So isn't it going to be an interesting year?
It's going to be a very interesting year. Yeah, it is. And let's hope we can galvanise the public, the great New Zealand public, to get out there and bloody well vote. And make it clear to these pricks that you work for us, not the Chinese, not someone else. We pay your salaries. You act in the interest of New Zealand, not fucking New York, not the United Nations. But New Zealanders.
Well, Jacinda is sort of untouchable at the moment.
Jacinda. Look, I used to know Jacinda's dad, Ross Ardern. He was a detective sergeant in Hamilton. He used to chase me around.
He's up in Niue as a police commissioner.
Yeah, but what qualifications does that seem to be the High Commissioner for bloody Niue or the government administrator, whatever that is up there? Exactly. Apart from being Jacinda's dad, but I mean, it's just crazy stuff, Yeah, exactly. But
so she's untouchable.
Well, no, she's not untouchable. If people knew, Jacinda's probably about the best you could get going. Most people think. They think, well, what's the alternative?
Well, that is the problem.
That's the alternative. Yeah, there's no alternative, real effective alternative. And these people have sort of. Well, there's people out there who go to the average pub. I mean, there's not many people go to a lot of people don't go, but I do, right? And people are disgruntled and they are to me.
Disenfranchised.
They're disenfranchised. They don't know what to do. They need a bloody effective leader.
Where are our effective leaders?
Well, they've either been bought off, bribed, or dare I say, they've been bloody probably imprisoned on some chumped up charge. And don't think it doesn't happen in New Zealand.
Most people don't want to.
See, a lot of our people that would be Maori leaders and effective ones, they're in jail. They've been put in jail. With the mana, they've got the mana and the heart and how to win and stick up for their people. They're in jail.
But Maori can't galvanise themselves together as one cohesive unit.
That's right. It was tribal structure, you see. Always was. Always, you know. And I've been. Well, there's an old saying. There's an old saying, Steve. Divide and rule, right? And that's what's going on.
Divide and conquer.
Divide and conquer. Divide and rule. Divide and conquer, right? And that's what happens. You need to stick together and bloody well, you know, support each other, not be divided and ruled.
John Tamahiri? Now he's running for the marathon?
JT's a good man, you know. I wish to Christ he was actually Auckland Mayor. He wouldn't do any worse than the bloody bugger that's in there, that Phil, you know.
Well, he was Labor.
Yeah, he was Labor. Yeah, I know, like hell he was Labor. Phil Goff, he was a bloody hard-out right-winger in disguise. You know, and when I used to see photos of Phil Goff in his office with pictures of Michael Joseph Savage and other, you know, Labor luminaries behind him, I think they'd be turning over in their bloody graves if they could see what you were doing, Phil Goff. You know, I had a particular beef to go on with the bugger over, you know, his hypocrisy. Now, I can stand a lot, right, Steve, except bloody sheer-minded hypocrisy, right? Phil Goff was a Justice Minister for a while, right, under Helen Clark, right? And parents would come into Phil Goff and say, look, Mr. Goff, why don't you soften up the drug laws? You know, here's our children, you know, maybe out for a bit of marijuana or whatever, and it blights their travel chances, their bloody career prospects, etc., etc., etc. And old Phil's grin is there, do the crime, do the time, right? You know, that sort of hard-nosed attitude, you know. And hey, guess what happened? Well, Phil's daughter Sarah got caught coming out of a rave party in Sydney. Yeah. Now, there's a bit of history with Sarah. She'd got a bloody sweet job at MFAT, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I'm not going to say how she got it, 26 years old, senior position. Right, had to travel a lot. So she comes out of this rave party in bloody Sydney and she's got some ecstasy tabs hidden in her bra, under her bra.
Oh,
now don't ask me what they were.
Isn't that illegal under the Crimes Act 1975?
Well, this was Sydney, New South Wales, and it was obviously illegal because our Sarah was charged. Phil's Sarah was charged and taken up in the court in bloody Sydney and fined, right? Possession, you know, a relatively small amount of ecstasy. There's about 4 tabs or something, right? Hidden in her bra, so she's obviously got a bit of history. Knows what to do, you know. She's not a bloody young, gullible, naive, shall we say. Well, guess what? She comes back to Aussie, back to Kiwiland and tells Dad. Now, Dad sees the implications here obviously on the fucking horizon. So guess what? Suddenly, and I did a bit of looking into this actually, Steve, and our Phil had been to New South Wales quite a bit and he's part of the Young Labour team. So he made a few connections in New South Wales, you see. Funny enough, guess what happens? Sarah's case gets called back before the New South Wales local court, and suddenly the conviction just disappears. It's discharged, gone. And she pleaded guilty to possession of ecstasy, right?
Well, she should have the record.
Now, somehow this... I know, like other Kiwis, parents who want their children to be dealt with in a similar fashion, right?
Should be a 501.
Well, she could be a 501 if the conviction hadn't mysteriously been disappeared, shall we say, you know, revoked. Discharged. No conviction for Sarah in New South Wales anymore. Go and look at the criminal records. It doesn't exist anymore. But the record that she pleaded guilty does.
So the issue that we're facing here is the integrity of our politicians, of our bureaucrats, and New Zealanders are suffering.
Well, of course they're suffering, and in the most deeply personal ways, especially in relation to their children. You know, this family court fiasco that goes on all the time.
I told you that Vanley and Orangatangariki.
I just want to go back to Sarah and Phil because there's something a bit illustrative there, right? Well, back the next thing, it becomes public in New Zealand. I'm not going to say it became public, but our media got to learn about this, you see, and you know. So they go to Phil. It's on Google it now. You'll see it. And Phil, they said, Phil, my daughter doesn't touch drugs. My daughter doesn't do any drugs. I can tell you that right now. You know, as any father probably would, right? But hey, this is the guy that's been saying, no, your kids do the crime, do the time, right? So back we go to that, and so Phil goes and does this, and busters his way out of it, and tells lies again. He, you know, of course his daughter's doing drugs. What's she doing with bloody 4 or 5 ecstasy tabs in a bra, right? Okay, but Phil says, well, hey Phil, you didn't think about this, did you? What's the alternative if she's in possession of drugs, not for her own use, Phil, for supply? To give, hold, whatever, that's supply, right? Guess what the penalty for possession of Class A drugs is in New South Wales for supply, Phil, right? Yeah, and you're meant to be a lawyer, Phil. Christ, come on, man. Look, we understand you stuck up for your daughter. We understand any parent would. But hey, what's good for your daughter is good for bloody Steve's daughter, if he's got daughter, I don't know. Or other people that have got children, right? Okay, we don't want our kids having bloody criminal records either for stupid soft drug charges.
But we do have a serious drug problem in New Zealand with regard to methamphetamine. And there's one thing that I disagree with everybody.
Yeah.
Meths is dangerous.
Of course it's dangerous, but
It causes the massive spike in family violence. It's caused mental health issues.
Yep.
And it's costing us billions.
Well, yeah, because it's being dealt with as a criminal justice issue rather than a health issue. And it's the cost of the money and the stuff of this drug that's driving that causes a lot of the problem. Some of my clients are, alleged drug dealers and all the rest of it, right, Steve? So I have a pretty close knowledge, and I've been in prison obviously with a lot of people that have suffered and, users and all the rest of it, right? The problem with most drugs is it's not so much the drug that does cause harm in a lot of instances. It generally magnifies what's already there, right? Already there. I mean, there's tens of thousands of methamphetamine users that quite function quite safely in society because they've got the money and they can pay for it, right?
Well, it's worth billions in New Zealand.
Absolutely it is, right? I believe that nearly all drugs should be decriminalised and dealt with as a health issue, as they do in Portugal. And drug use has gone down, hey, amazingly enough. But there's far too much harm done by the present system. It's got to change.
Well, it happened in Colorado when they legalised marijuana.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, you've got to start thinking about this rather than a knee-jerk reaction. You look into the realities of the situation. We all know, everybody knows, and where's ever been the moral argument for bloody marijuana being illegal? Where's that ever been? The harm caused by marijuana is it being illegal.
Well, opioids with Big Pharma are just as dangerous.
I know that. Well, that's right, oxycodone, go and look at some of that, I mean, it's just disgusting. So where's the moral argument?
So what's your view of this idea of this drug court?
No, it's a good idea. I like it because drug offences should not be criminal offences, other than major supply.
Maybe. Well, Chloe, the Green MP.
Chloe Sorber.
Yeah. She's pushing for... along the lines of Portugal.
Well, she's being realistic. Let's get our heads out the sand. Forget all the bloody rhetoric and the drama and the bullshit. Let's look at the realities of the situation. Listen to people that actually know what's going on there. In reality, it's not working what's going on at the moment, is it? This present situation is unsustainable in the long run. Even the United States is giving up on the war on drugs, a lot of the states. There's other interests that want to keep it going, mainly tobacco and alcohol interests, right? Mm-hmm. They want to keep it going. But it can't go on like it is for too much longer. I mean, there's too much, there's too many people's lives being ruined through it being illegal. There's too much money being spent on it. In the United States, the vast majority of their prisoners have to do with drugs.
Is it the same here in New Zealand?
It is the same here in New Zealand.
So we would never have to build more prisons?
No, we wouldn't. We could close half of them down tomorrow.
But we'd have to build more mental health units or counselling units or rehabilitation units away from drugs?
Well, I'll tell you what. We don't need to guess what might happen. Let's go and look at what's happened in Portugal, right? What's happened, right? And also Uruguay. Let's go and look at the reality, the truth, the facts, not the speculation, the bloody, the fear-mongering. Go and look at what's happened in countries that have done it.
It's incredible.
Yeah, and that's what we do. Yeah. I mean, why should we go down a failed path, continue to go down it? Let's go down a successful one where it's succeeded.
And we're small enough to be able to do it.
We absolutely are. We could be the bloody, a shining example to the world, just like we were when we gave
women
the vote.
We could be the leader in that, not just as COVID.
Exactly. Why should we be the South Pacific's bloody hellhole again? There's too many lives being ruined by people being put in prison for this stuff. I see it all the time, and it's disgusting. And it doesn't have to be that way. And that's why I'm very passionate about it, Steve. You can probably tell that.
I don't disagree to some extent.
Yeah.
But the issue we've got is we don't have the facilities in the mental health environment to be able to deal and protect these people.
The money we save from closing down half of our prisons and bloody, very diverting resources would be far outweigh any additional costs or resources.
One of the frustrations I have is that the proceeds of crime, right? We're taking lots and lots of money away. The proceeds of crime. For drugs. Okay. Money laundering, etc., etc. Why are we not spending that on mental health?
Exactly.
Why is it going back into the trough?
Well, because the powers that be have got more say than the people that want it in the back in the trough where it'll do the most good. Now, I'm going to tell you something. Any idiot that thinks the war on drugs is working, and there's so much evidence it's not, look at the price of methamphetamine, right? I think when I was a drug dealer, I dabbled in drugs, right? Never ever used them, by the way. I think it was about $1,000 a gram, right? Guess what it is out there now on the street? You could probably get it for $250 a bloody gram. Right, so what does that tell you about how effective the stopping of the drugs coming to New Zealand is? Right? You can never succeed. It's impossible. It's like putting a finger in a dike that's got 1 million holes. You'll never succeed. So you have to deal with the realities. Go down the road Portugal has a successful route. And we'll get somewhere, and so many lives won't be blighted, and our human capital that's been squandered can be utilised for the good of the public, rather than, all negative stuff like it is at the moment.
But some resources have to be allocated towards that mental health and rehabilitation.
Well, of course they do. There needs to be if we didn't have such petty, squabbling politicians, it's a no-brainer.
But they're not strong enough to dictate to the bureaucrats, because the bureaucrats run the place.
Well, that's right. Well, because the bureaucrats, and Calvin Davis is a perfect example.
Please don't get me on Calvin.
I have a very intimate and close knowledge of how our correction system works, right, through having experienced it over so many years. Right, Calvin will go and he'll say, I want this done. And there'll be 1 million. I'm sorry, Minister, that can't happen. No, what's the reason? Oh, no, 1 million reasons. Because Calvin hasn't got a bloody clue about how the prison system really operates. He can't say no. If he had me sitting at his right hand, right, I'd say, come on a minute. There. Of course you can do it. How do you do it there? Right, I'd tell him. Right? And these bureaucrats will be put in their bloody place where they belong. But,
I've met with Calvin a number of times.
Yeah.
And he will
He's a
not.
nice bloke.
He will not make a comment about the government using children in international drug operations.
No.
He won't make a comment.
Well, his ministers are probably advising that it could open up to litigation or something,
Well, I'm coming.
Yeah. Well, there's 1 million reasons. Look, these bureaucrats they've got a bloody manual on how to beat your minister, how to make your minister do what you want to do instead of what he wants. I'm sure they have. Honestly, go and watch Westminster. It should be compulsory viewing for every bloody budding, every budding bloody minister.